Welcome everybody, thank you for turning up. I think all the important people are here. Today we're going to be doing a talk on economic value chains, costing the impact of risk. Myself, Peter Tarr, and my colleague here, Colin Sandel, we've both been analysing problems and helping people make decisions for more years than we care to talk about. We've both got lots of experience of doing things like balance of investment and doing cost effectiveness trade-offs. And Colin is the inventor of economic value chains. So what we're going to talk about today, what we've found over the years is that people don't necessarily think about disruptive events in quite the right way, and they don't really know what the full scope and cost of those events would be. Now, we've mainly focused this on cyber attacks because it's an area we've been looking at. And so we wanted to come up with a technique where we could actually work out what is the cost and the consequence of a cyber attack on an organisation and how would we go about measuring that. To put some context on this, we're going to use an example that you're probably all familiar with, the NHS's recent WannaCry attack. So you'll all have heard about this in the news. This is the attack that happened in May this year, and it's quite topical because the National Audit Office just recently published their report into the investigation of what happened, and they came up with some quite interesting findings. So some of those I'll go through now. So WannaCry was the largest cyber attack to affect the NHS. There had been several other attacks in the past, all quite small, never made it to the news. And actually, so therefore the NHS had plenty of warning about cyber attacks. They knew it was coming, people had told them the systems are obsolete, you need to upgrade them. They hadn't really paid much attention to it. So you've got to ask the question, why are the management of the organisation not paying attention to these sort of risks? Well, maybe they don't think it's going to impact on patient care, delivery of patient services. Maybe they thought the risk's not that important, it doesn't really have a big impact, so therefore I can maybe save money by not implementing the defences. But obviously, as we saw from the WannaCry attack, it affected around about a third of the trusts in England. You had people who were getting diverted from A&E, so they were turning up in an emergency and getting told they have to go to a different hospital. Well, if that was you and you were in a life-threatening condition, you wouldn't be very happy about that. It could actually have caused even more disruption than it did. They actually got very lucky with this one, so we will talk a bit about that in terms of whether this was a representation of the true risk that they're carrying in terms of a cyber attack. It was stopped by a stroke of luck really by a cyber researcher. If that hadn't happened, it could be they could have been affected all the trusts. So there was thousands of appointments that were cancelled, operations were cancelled. There was some people who were in quite a lot of distress. There was cases of people going to get results of test cases for cancer, getting to the hospital and then being told, oh, we can't tell you because we haven't got the systems up and running. We can't schedule a new appointment. You'll have to just go away. I mean, that's probably quite distressing, I would imagine. But the two things that really stood out from this report that the NAO did was that the organisations could have taken relatively simple steps to actually protect themselves. So each trust is responsible for its own data security and its own cyber protection, so that people within the trust have implemented in different ways. And actually, some of the simple things like just keeping the firewalls up to date, patching the systems, would actually have stopped this from ever occurring. So there was a relatively simple implementation of something they could have done to prevent it, but actually the department still doesn't know how much the attack actually cost them, even after it's occurred, which is mind-boggling. You've got to know these things in terms of future risk. Ideally, you would have wanted to know what the cost of this risk was before it occurred. And then you could say, this risk is maybe going to cost me, I don't know, £1 billion. Yeah? Then it go, is it worth implementing the control measures for if it cost me £1 million, would I do it? Well, of course it would. So maybe by having a way of saying, I can demonstrate what the cost of the risk is going to be, it makes it easier to make a business case to say, I want to take some action on this because I can demonstrate what the payoff's going to be. So in this case, a lot of the NHS managers probably thought, well, it's not a big impact, all the previous ones have been small, they haven't really made any difference, so there's not much risk there. So we had to develop a technique to think, well, how can I actually assess this? So we came up with this thing called economic value chains, which we'll refer to as EVC just to keep it nice and short, to try and calculate the cost of what the inaction would be. So if I didn't do anything, what is the risk going to be of a cyber attack? And therefore, I can then assess what's the cost benefit of actually taking some action. I can do a comparison of the two and say, am I getting value for money? So where does the risk come from? So for a cyber attack, risks come from several sources. Project inaction. So this is an example of like the NHS. They didn't have sufficient safeguards. They didn't implement it in a timely manner. They got plenty of warnings. The patches were available several months before. They didn't implement them. Also, project action causes risks. So people implement new systems. They maybe withdraw the fallbacks. By introducing new systems, they introduce new vulnerabilities, new threat vectors. And often the projects are treated individually rather than thinking about the risk at an organisational level. So each individual project will introduce a new system, deal with their individual risks, but actually the cyber risk is at an organisational level. And of course, the environment in which you're operating is always changing. So the threats have always come up with new ways of attacking you, new systems that come out give you new vulnerabilities. So the key thing here is that the risk cannot be dealt with by any one project, and you can't just ignore it in between your projects. So it's an ongoing fight, and you've got to deal with it at an organisational level. So the other things we need to think about in terms of if we're coming up with a technique to determine what the cost of these risks are, is we also want to be able to quantify the consequences. We also want to be looking at things like what's the cost of identifying non-effects. So if somebody has hacked your system, how much is it going to cost you to prove that your data hasn't been compromised, hasn't been stolen, hasn't been changed? I mean, if you think about your organisation, if somebody just said, we've hacked your organisation and changed your data, even if they haven't done it, how much is it going to cost you to actually prove that? And that can actually be often more than the cost of repairing the actual attacks. And then we need a technique that allows us to show, well, what do the mitigation options do? So if we change a certain part of the system, what impact does that have on the level of risk we're carrying? So what is the cost of the risk now? And often the risks will be uncertain. You might not know exactly how many trusts were going to be infected, for example. So you can put some uncertainty on that and then get an idea of what's the actual range of risk I'm potentially carrying. And that allows you then to look at, well, where do I prioritise my mitigations? What package of mitigations do I need together? And what is the cost benefit of actually doing some action versus the cost of inaction? So I will now pass over to my colleague, Colin, who's going to actually talk about the EVC method in a lot more detail.
Right. Hopefully you can hear me. Yep. So what Peter said, this came from cyber. There's nothing in this technique that's specific to cyber. It applies to physical systems, and actually one of the problems with cyber investigations is people forget that cyber systems sit in the physical world. There's nothing here about deliberate actions, about people going out to attack you. It could be a fire, it could be a flood. The cyber system doesn't have to be what you're delivering, it could be what you're relying on to deliver. So what happens to your project if you lose your IT, if your systems get encrypted, if your data gets corrupted? So there's all sorts of ways that these risks can play out. What we're gonna, want to press the right button? What I'm just gonna look at is some examples of how the technique is applied. So I'm using an example of WannaCry, partly because it's in the public domain, so nobody can sue me for giving bad information out about them. So one way that it could impact is you lose the availability of systems. So the process of building up this structure is that you're gradually breaking the problem down into more manageable chunks, into something you can actually start to quantify. So they did lose systems. They didn't have a confidentiality breach. As far as the NAO is concerned, they lost no data. But it could have happened. A future cyber attack, it could happen. So what I can say in this diagram is this is out of scope of this particular context, but needs to be considered. Did they lose data? Yes, they did. A lot of it was actually self-inflicted. They turned their systems off. They wrote things on bits of paper and then threw the paper away. But they did lose data as a result. No data was corrupted. It wasn't that sort of attack, but it could have been. So if you're starting from scratch and saying, what are my risks? These need to be considered. And loss of capability. Even where every system worked, they would have MRI scanners that worked perfectly, but they couldn't get the data back to A&E because they lost the network or they lost connectivity to the network. So things started to unravel in ways they hadn't actually anticipated. In terms of loss of availability, they lost medical systems. They actually turned equipment off. They lost patient data. They couldn't get to it. They lost appointment records. They didn't know who was coming, and they lost control. They didn't know who was supposed to be where and where the staff were. They had no ability to actually contact ambulances. They couldn't contact patient transport. So they had patients ready to go and no way of actually getting transport for them. So all sorts of things started to unravel that weren't related to the actual impact. They didn't have billing problems because NHS doesn't work that way. It didn't affect any retail outlets, and it didn't affect any payment systems. Well, as far as the NHS is concerned, if they're paying a bit late, it's probably okay. But it wasn't that sort of attack, but could have been. When you look at the patient data, you then start to break it down again and go, well, how do you lose patient data? You lose the IT that you've got to access it. You could lose environmental systems, so you could actually lose heating, you could lose lighting, you could lose air conditioning. So you could achieve some of these effects by hitting physical systems or by having a failure in those physical systems. One example is all sorts of flight chaos a few months ago because someone actually hit air conditioning and power in one of the comm centres. You could lose power. So you could have a system that's beautifully resilient, but if you don't have power on the front desk to get access to it, you can't use it. So it's thinking about all the possible ways in which the risk could actually manifest. And they lost communication. Their sitcom system wasn't affected. Their email servers were not affected, but people unplugged. So there was a lot of communication problems that were self-inflicted. So the actions that were taken actually magnified the problem in some areas. Is that, when you think about risk, is that the sort of level that you need to capture? And then moving that over, in terms of the IT, you could have incorrect diagnosis if you don't have the right information. You certainly had cancelled appointments. People turned up and they couldn't get to the scans, they couldn't get to X-ray results, they couldn't get to blood test results. So all the data was there, and all the staff were there, but they couldn't get to the information to do the work. They cancelled operations. So you start to get knock-on effects. If you're cancelling an operation, then you're rescheduling, then you're moving stuff back. How does that play out? They had problems discharging patients. They had problems of patients being diverted. So there were NHS trusts that shut down their A&E departments completely. And this is where they started to see effects. So trusts that had done everything, that had protected themselves, that had done all the risk assessments, had put all the mitigations in, suddenly found lots of patients turning up at their door that they hadn't expected. So they were being affected by this, even though they were not infected by the virus at all. So I don't know whether they would have been in their sort of risk and risk planning, is the effects of other people not doing their jobs, and the effects of other people being the weaker chain, the weaker link in the chain. So some trusts were very strong, but were still impacted by this event. And what you can then do is start to say, well, in terms of cancelled appointments, how do I put a price to it? Well, I can think about the number. I can think about the value of an appointment. And the government does do this, and there are values published. So here's an attack, 2,800 appointments cancelled. There may have been follow-on appointments. And the cost of those appointments, an appointment is valued at hospital at £160 roughly. But what's the medical effect of delays? Delaying treatment, having to reschedule treatment. What's the cost of transport? If you've actually got hospital transport bringing people and then taking them away again for no effect, you've got costs. So you can start to get a picture of where the cost might be, and that works out to be about 450,000. So what you do with EVC is you break the problem down to the point where you can start to put estimates in, and then you let them propagate back through the structure. Now this wasn't WannaCry. This was an attack called Globe 2. It was a ransomware attack, and it hit one particular hospital trust. And this happened in October 16. So this was in advance. The same trust got hit by WannaCry. So you might expect that if they've been hit once, they'll learn from it, they'll put the mitigations in, but whatever action they took didn't work. So, looking at WannaCry itself, there were nearly 19,500 cancelled appointments at hospitals at £160 each is about 3.1 million. We do not know how many GP appointments were cancelled because there is no data. And part of it was because GPs that were affected stopped recording who was turning up and who wasn't turning up because they couldn't function. So the data was lost as a consequence of the attack. But 595 practices were affected. So you can start to get an estimate for, this went on for a day or so. So what you're starting to be able to do is I've only got part of the problem mapped out here, but I've got a price tag of 3.1 million. If I add in the previous attack and I'm saying I'm not after WannaCry, I'm after vulnerability to ransomware, it's about 3.6 million. Is that already enough to say, actually, something's got to be done here? Is this evidence to actually take action and put mitigations in? It didn't seem to be, because a lot of trusts didn't do what was required. Where I think they may have fallen down was they had projects to bring in systems, but all the systems they brought in were being supported by Microsoft, but they didn't put the patches in. So they were kind of in between project phases. They'd brought in one system, they weren't going to replace it yet, and I think the eye comes off the equipment between those. Once you've done all this, and you've built up a big diagram and you've talked to people, you can then use the same structure to communicate your answers. So what I've got here is a heat map. But it's a different structure. You can see at a glance where your cost is. So I can quite easily track down that structure and say that's where most of my cost is coming from. And I can go and look at why. Why am I getting these costs? To break that cost, you've got to try and break the chain. So are there things you can do in this chain? Can I stop certain consequences happening? It gives you an idea as to where to focus your mitigations. If I can't stop it happening, I need to weaken those inputs. Can I make it last longer? Can I detect it quicker? Can I react faster? Can I reduce the scope of it? Can I make sure it doesn't impact certain critical functions? Yes, okay, I'll lose GPs, but I don't want to lose operating theatres. I don't want to lose A&E. So by building the structure, you start to get an idea not just what the number is, but why it is and what you do about it. You also notice in this structure there's a lot of white, which is areas where there is no cost. The question that's worth asking there is, what stops there being a cost? Are there things that I've got to be careful not to undo? Do I have protections and mitigations in place that I really don't want to remove by accident? And it's very easy for one project to undo something somewhere else without realising it. So it's thinking not just about what do I need to make better, but what do I need to not make worse? What do I have to protect as part of the work? And one example is you roll in a lovely automated appointment system, everybody comes into a GP, signs themselves in, well, they're on Windows 7. They could have been affected by the virus. You lose potentially your manual fallbacks. You no longer have a little book with the appointments written in. Is that something where you want to keep some form of paper copy? You want to have a paper audit trail. You want to have a printout at the start of day. You don't want to lose that paperness because that's your protection. An important thing about this is you're not trying to cost the world. You're not trying to cost everything. So I'm not interested in what the salary bill of the NHS is, because that didn't change. What I'm interested in is the overtime element. They had to have people actually come in and fix things. That's the bit you're interested in. So you're trying to cost what actually changes rather than what isn't changing, which is simpler than a lot of costing techniques that do try and cost the world. You can explicitly record what you've excluded. So those black nodes, they're not in scope of this type of attack, and I can say why. I can put the white nodes in, there is no cost here, and I can say why. And then you've got a picture. You can print a picture out, put it in front of people, put it in front of senior management and say, do you agree with that? I'm saying that's a 0. If you don't agree with it, tell me what happens to the right. Tell me why it's not a 0. So rather than big spreadsheets, lots of formulae, it's a picture. People understand pictures. People can communicate pictures. So that diagram, it's how you capture, it's how you structure your thoughts. It's how you explain the structure to people, because people can follow the diagram. It gets your stakeholder buy-in. You can ask people, you can scribble on it, you can make notes on it. It's very easy for people to understand. But it also defines your calculations. So in that, each node is a type of calculation. So that defines your mathematical model. So you can take that picture, hit a button, you've now got a mathematical model behind it, you can put your data in, and then you put the results back in the same picture. So the diagram you've used to understand the problem, to communicate the problem, is now how you explain the results of the problem. So it's very easy for people to actually understand what's going on and where the numbers are and why they are, rather than jumping from pie charts to Excel to other formats. So I'm going to hand back to Peter, and he's going to just run through a final few slides.
Thanks, Colette. Right, so now that we've got a model that tells us what the cost of this risk might be, how do we use that to help us make better decisions going forward? So one way is going to be about mitigation options. So I can look at the various mitigation options that are available, tweak the model, see what the impact on the risk is, and then I can get an idea of which ones are going to make a big difference to the outcome and which ones aren't. The other thing is also there will be some uncertainty around these options as well. So what I can also do is in my data input for the model, I can say, I don't actually know the exact value, but I know there's a distribution around what it might be. So I can put that in, run it as a Monte Carlo, set up lots of replications, and it'll tell me what does my range of risk look like. So this now tells me, is the mitigation options impacting a lot all the time, a little bit some of the time? You know, is the risk that we've seen with WannaCry towards the low end of what we would expect, or the high end? So once I've looked at my options, it then gives me a way of looking and saying, how do I prioritize which ones I implement? Do I need to implement a portfolio of them to achieve anything substantial? And that allows us to work the cost benefit of doing something versus doing nothing. So if we think about the WannaCry one, it's only illustrative. If the NHS thinks, oh, that's how all ransomware attacks would occur, and that would be the cost of them, then they might go, oh, well, I can put mitigation in place to get rid of part of that risk. But actually, in my opinion, I think they were very lucky on this particular attack. And if you took the same sort of attack 100 times, this would probably be in the bottom 5 of what the cost would be. Why was that? Well, it happened on a Friday, stroke of luck, because it didn't affect any of the appointments over the weekend, because there's a lot less appointments. It was blocked by luck on Friday evening, so they only had 1 day of being infected and it moving around the system. If that had been a week, probably all the trusts might have been affected. It was a very obvious cyber attack. I mean, there's a big red flashing screen that tells you you've been hacked. So you know you've been hacked, so it's fairly obvious. Some of them are a lot more subtle than that, and you might not even know you've been infected for a week. Specifically, the NHS wasn't targeted. It was just a global ransomware. If somebody actually tried and targeted the NHS, I'm sure they could make a lot better job of it and steal all the data and make all the systems go down. And also the trusts didn't, as Colin mentioned, didn't react to any of the previous events or any of the guidance they were provided or any of the patches or any of the NHS digital warnings about this. And the question you've got to ask yourself is, why wouldn't they do that? Probably because they didn't understand what the cost of the risk was on the event. So if they knew that, then they probably would have implemented the solutions, or it would give them a better way of justifying the cost of implementing those solutions versus the risk they're carrying. So if you've got your senior manager and you say, I want to spend £10 million on cyber defences, and they say, what difference is it going to make? How much is it going to save me? How's it going to reduce the risk? If you can't answer that question, are they going to give you the money? I probably wouldn't either. So to conclude, we've developed this EVC technique. As you've seen by the tree structure, it's a thorough bottom-up investigation of cost and risk. You can add the detail where you need it in the tree. And where you don't need the detail, you can either do it at a high level or just say, actually, this isn't relevant to this particular problem. It's very easy to understand. It's transparent. It's very visual, easy to follow. It's very easy to construct and extend where you need to. And it captures the risk at the organisational level rather than at the project level, which is very important, because that's where a lot of cyber risk occurs. You might think you've done a perfect cyber solution and defence on your particular project, but as we've seen from what happened with the NHS, trusts are still impacted by other trusts that weren't up to speed with where they should have been with the defences. It allows us to also evaluate, what's the correct response we should be taking, what mitigation options are of value, and basically provides us with evidence to allow us to make better decisions and get value for money. So if anybody's got any questions, now's the time to ask them. I believe there's supposed to be a microphone going around. Yes, there it is. You can clap now or at the end. Do you want to stand up there as well?
Is this a commercially available product?
At present, no. So we've done the research on it, we've developed it as a prototype, and we've used it on a couple of case studies. We're intending to trial it more internally within our own company first, but that is where we're aiming to get to with this. But currently it is not available off the shelf by a license. It's where we're at with it, basically. It's that part in its life cycle. But if you're interested, let me know and we can put you on the list for the first copy. Any more questions? Straightforward then. If anybody comes up with a question later, we'll be hanging around here for a bit, or you can catch us in the various coffee bars or whatever. We'll probably be over there for a bit. But thank you for turning up, and I hope you found it interesting. Cheers.